out of there, get out in the world where you belong. Go do something difficult because what you're doing isn't acceptable. And the first thing he does is go somewhere there's a terrible famine, and then he goes somewhere there's a tyranny. So, it's pretty funny. He follows God's call, and it's not like sweetness and light and paradise immediately. It's nothing like that. It's instantaneous combat, of the most difficult kind. So, but Abraham does in fact follow that impulse. And it's interesting too. I mean, I don't know. Here's another thing that made me an advocate of psychoanalytic thinking. And it was the sort of thing that started to terrify me about what the human psyche was actually like. I started to understand that not only were we like an amalgam of relatively autonomous subpersonalities, each of which had the possibility of gaining control, but that we were also victim, you might say, or beneficiary of impulses that were beyond our conscious formulation or understanding or capacity to resist. So here's a funny story. So I was talking to one of my Patreon people online this week, and he said he was a committed atheist, and that's fine. Lots of atheists are very honest people, and they're atheists because they don't know how to reconcile what they know with traditional claims, let's say, and they're not willing to just mangle them together, And there might be cynicism, all that associated with it as well. But he said he was entranced by these biblical lectures, which is pretty weird. And he said if someone would have told him a year ago that he was going to be obsessed with a sequence of biblical lectures, he would have told them that they were mad. And so we had a bit of a discussion about that, because this is an interesting thing, And he mentioned this. He said, it was something like, you don't choose your interests, they choose you. And that's really worth thinking about too, man, because, it's really hard to get interested in something you're not interested in, even if you know there's a good reason for it. You're studying for an exam, you find the material boring, anything will be more interesting than the studying. Even though you know that that's what you need to do, you can't voluntarily grab yourself by the scruff of the neck, let's say, and shake yourself and say, sit down and concentrate. Your mind will just go everywhere. But then if you're interested in something, and even if it's something you shouldn't be interested in, because that happens all the time, then it's like you're laser focused, man. You can pay attention forever. You can work until you're exhausted. You won't even notice it, and you remember everything. It's like, okay, if you can't control your interest, what does? And man, I tell you, you can think about that for a very long time. So Jung talked about the spirit Mercurius. Mercury is the winged messenger of the gods. And here's how he conceptualized it psychologically. He thought this is what the ancient people who thought about Mercury as the winged messenger of the gods were trying to state psychologically. Your interest flits around. It's like there's something that captures it and that moves your interest from place to place. Like if you walk into a bookstore, you'll get interested in a particular book. And it's as if the book grips you. Because you don't know why you're interested in that. You might, but often you don't know why you're interested in that book. Your interest is flitting around. And so that's Mercury. The thing that makes your interest flicker around is Mercury, the winged messenger of the gods. And Mercury is the messenger of the gods because it's the things behind the scenes psychologically that are manipulating your attention. And for Jung, those were equivalent in some sense to the lost gods. And so for Jung, your interest was being manipulated behind the scenes by unseen forces that were associated with your characterological development across time. That was the manifestation of the self. So the self is the potential you, let's say. And the way it operates in the present is by gripping your interest and directing it somewhere. And that's part of the instinct of self-realization. It's a mind-boggling idea, man. Really, I think it's correct. I can't see how it can't be correct. It doesn't mean I understand it completely, but it certainly seems phenomenologically correct. And I mean, the potential that you are has to manifest itself somehow in the here and now. It has to. And what better way than by directing your attention? It's like, it seems like this might be useful for you. Or maybe you get attracted to this person. Or maybe you admire this person. That happens with kids a lot. They'll admire someone and then copy them. And you can see that that's obviously part of their developmental progression. Right? It's a form of hero worship, but kids are very imitative and they hero worship at the drop of a hat. And so they're entranced by the next stage of development. And if they see someone who embodies that, especially if it's in the zone of proximal development, it's something they could achieve, stretching a bit. They find someone who embodies that next stage of development, and then they start to imitate them and act like them. Well, adults are no different. We're no different. We do it at a perhaps more abstract and sophisticated level. So, okay, so Jacob and Esau are hostile brothers. They're like Cain and Abel, except the mixture of Cain and Abel, and they're very different. Esau was red and covered with hair. He was a hunter and a man of the field. So he's like your basic jock, right? He's extroverted, he's outgoing, he's really tough. He's like extraordinarily masculine. He hunts, and he's a real favorite of his father. And so, and Jacob isn't. He's a dweller in tents. And yeah, right, exactly, right. And it says Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now that's a problem, right? That's a big problem, and there's a Freudian element to this. It's like this family is now divided because one child is the favorite of the mother, and that's Jacob, and one child is the favorite of the father. And so Jacob is kind of a mother's boy, I guess, to use a rather archaic phrase, and certainly not as admirable from his father's perspective as Esau, who's a tough guy who goes out with a bow and arrow and wanders around in the plains and brings animals home, and he's tough. He's a tough guy. So, but there's this discord in the family because one parent prefers one child and the other parent prefers the other. And it's obvious from the story that the parents do not communicate about this because they really take sides. And so there's a split in the family. And that's, I think, very realistic because one of the things that you do learn if you have a family, and of course most of you do, but if you also think about families, is that there's deep divisions within families very, very frequently that no one will ever talk about. Or even think about often because it's too painful to think about, And Freud himself said, Freud was clearly his mother's favorite, and the family sacrificed a lot, including some of the potential ambitions of the other children in order to kind of put Sigmund Freud up on a pedestal and advance his education, and it worked. I mean, he turned into a great man, but there was a cost to his siblings. And Freud himself said that there was something about being the favorite of the mother that gave a person additional confidence throughout their life. And there's something to be said about that. Even someone like Erik Erikson, he noted that, very interested in child development, that first bonding with the mother was the place where trust was established. Maybe trust even in the goodness of existence was established. And so, anyways, Jacob is Rachel's favorite, and Esau is Isaac's favorite. Now Esau, being extroverted, let's say, is also a bit impulsive, and maybe he's a man of action. Red lentils, and Esau comes in from the hunt and he's like half starved to death, and he's sitting there, and the aroma of these red lentils reaches him, and he's exhausted, and he tells Jacob that he wants some of this stew, and Jacob, who's being a pain in the neck fundamentally, basically says no. There's a teasing thing going on here, and won't give him any, and there's, you have to imagine this because it's not laid out explicitly in the story, but there's some dispute about whether Esau gets to have lunch, and Jacob finally says, well, I'll give you some, but you have to give me your birthright. And Esau, you think he must say something like, well, to hell with it, take it, you son of a bitch, take it. Just give me some damn stew. It's something like that. So that's what happens. But with these archaic people, once you made a statement like that, you were done. That was it. And so Esau sells his birthright. And this turns out to be incredibly significant. Benson, who wrote biblical commentary, said, there's a bit of a twist to it. So Esau eats the red lentils, and then from then on his name is Red. And you got to use your imagination a bit. I mean, people are making fun of him, right? That's why they're calling him Red. I mean, he's already red because we established that, but no one was calling him Red before this. And so for the rest of his life, every time he goes out amongst his friends and family, they call him Red and sort of snicker because he's the, half-famished idiot who sold his birthright for a bowl of lentils. And so it's not that funny, actually. And so Esau is not happy about this. And it actually turns out that so what does it mean? It means don't sell the future for the desires of the present, and don't be casual about what you have. And then there's an archetypal element to this too. And Benson says, various have been the opinions what this birthright was which Esau sold. But the most probable is that together with the right of sacrificing, so determining what should be sacrificed and when, and being the priest of the family, it included the peculiar blessing promised to the seed of Abraham, that of being the progenitor of the Messiah and the heir of the special promises of God respecting Christ's kingdom. It was at least typical of spiritual privileges, those of the firstborn that are written in heaven. Well, that's a lot harsher than meets the eye to begin with. And so there's a very interesting, deep moral story there, which is, it's sort of, Esau does the opposite of a sacrifice. It's the reverse, right? He sacrifices the future for the present. And so the story basically says, the way it's laid out across stories, is that if you're the sort of person that sacrifices the future to the present, then that eradicates the possibility that you will bring the most noble being into existence. That's what it means. And you can, again, this is the psychological significance of the biblical story. So that's a bad thing to do if you want to realize your potential, let's say. You don't do reverse sacrifices. That's a very bad idea. And so Esau really did himself in by being too attached to the present without a vision of the future. So he's too in the moment, and he pays a heavy price for it. I mean, first of all, he loses his birthright and his double inheritance. So there's a practical consequence, and then there's a spiritual consequence, and then he's been made a fool of by his brother. Jacob means supplanter, by the way. That's what the name means. And Jacob is always trying to usurp Esau, as we've seen. And so Jacob gets one over on him, and doesn't make an older brother happy when a younger brother gets something over on him, that's for sure. And then he loses the opportunity to be the progenitor of the Messiah, which is like, he probably didn't realize that precisely, but it seems to be, it's kind of rough, that. So, and then there's a statement in Matthew 16:26, for what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? It's an echo of the same idea. And you think, well, what does this idea of soul mean? And it's not intellect. It's something like consciousness allied with character, I think. And I think the reason that it's valued so much is that, because you got to ask yourself, well, what do you really have when it comes down to it? So life is suffering, let's say, and you can pile up worldly goods, and the God in the Old Testament doesn't seem to have anything against that, really, right? The people who he favors seem to prosper quite nicely in the world, but they also have to make a choice between whether they're going to fundamentally sustain their character or whether they're going to prosper in the world when push comes to shove. And the idea constantly is that really what you have in the world that allows you the best possible defense against the suffering that's intrinsic to being is your character. That's what you have, period. And I don't think there is anything that's more psychologically true than that, because everything else, well, first of all, your relationships with others depend on your character. And certainly this is part of the story of Noah's Ark, because his generations were perfect. So he had a very tight familial arrangement. Everyone trusted each other. That's a big deal if you hit a rocky patch in your life, right? And it's character that determines that. If you're generous and honest and all of those things, and people know they can rely on you, assuming they're not resentful, that's a whole different story. Then they're going to come to your aid when it's necessary. They're going to pull together with you. And when people are really after you for one reason or another, and they're accusing you of all sorts of things, and you're guilty because you have a past that's laden with characterological errors, then it's very easy for people to take you down, because they'll poke until they hit a place where you're guilty, and then you're done, because you'll do yourself in with your own judgment. And so Esau makes a very big mistake. And there's a sacrificial idea here too, which is, now and then you're going to be faced with a situation where it's something you really want or your character. Maybe you'll have to lie about something, you know, and you'll think, what difference does it make? You know, I'll lie about it. Jacob does this, but the problem, there's a bunch of problems with that. One is that, well, now you know that you're the sort of person that will, in fact, deceive yourself about the nature of reality if something shiny is dangled in front of you. And that's not good because it undermines your faith in yourself. And when you're really in trouble, they call that the dark night of the soul. When you're really in trouble, that's what you've got. You've got whether or not you can trust yourself, and that's it. You know, when things are really harsh. And so if you've betrayed yourself in that manner, then you weaken yourself under the worst possible circumstances, and that's really not a good thing. So this is very practical advice. It's not casual moralizing. There's very little casual moralizing in these stories. In the next part of the story, there's some parallels with Abraham, and that's built into the narrative, I think, because Isaac is Abraham's descendant, and so we have to keep the narrative echoing forward, otherwise it loses its continuity. And there's a famine in the land that Isaac's in, and God tells him to stay the course anyways, repeating the promise he gave to Abraham, although Isaac goes to Abimelech, also telling the king and people that Rebekah was his sister, which is exactly what Abraham did when he went to Egypt. And so there's another echo there of the same. It's as if the story is being told for a second time, essentially, and that's supposed to remind you of the previous story. But they're careless. The king sees that Rebekah and Isaac are intimate together, and luckily he doesn't have them put to death. He just tells everybody in the kingdom that they're to be left the hell alone. And then Isaac prospers in that land, just like Abraham did in Egypt, until the Philistines ask him to leave. He's just getting too rich and powerful. Things are going too well for him, so he's asked to leave. Now, in the meantime, Esau gets married, and this is a funny little story. He says he marries two women who give grief to Isaac and Rebekah. So whoever Esau marries, they're not popular with their in-laws, not in the least. That actually becomes relevant a little later because they drive Rebekah quite mad. So I get a kick out of that because that's very common. You know, it's not easy to integrate new people into your family and hope that will go smoothly. It's actually one of the real catastrophes in life, right? You have a kid, and maybe you get along with them, and maybe you don't. But let's assume you do, but then they marry someone that you just don't like. Or maybe you think is wrong for them. I mean, that's really rough. What are you going to do about that? You know, because you're basically screwed both ways. If you have the person you love around, then you have to put up with this horrendous creature that they allied themselves with. And if you get rid of them completely, well, then you don't have your child anymore. So it's a very, very difficult position. And so that's another example of the realism, I think, of the stories. Now Isaac, who's hypothetically on his deathbed, asks Esau to hunt for venison because he likes venison and he's happy that his son is a hunter. And Rebekah overhears this, and so she conspires with Jacob to slaughter two small goats and make his father some stew because he wants Esau to make him stew out of venison. But Rebekah, who's being, I would say, let's say slightly deceitful or horribly lying, that would be more accurate, she conspires with Jacob, so Jacob kills two little goats, kids, and boils up a stew, and then he puts on some goat skins because Esau is a hairy character, and Rebekah dresses Isaac in Esau's clothing because Isaac can't see very well at this point, and so then Jacob goes into his father with the stew, and he's trying to disguise his voice, but it doesn't work very well. And so Isaac asks him to come close, and Jacob puts out his arm with the goat skin on it, and Isaac smells him too, and he smells like Esau, and which maybe wasn't the best thing, but and feels like him, and so because Isaac thinks he's on his deathbed, he decides to deliver a blessing hypothetically to Esau, and so, but it's Jacob. And so that's a big deal too, because the blessing is actually, as I said before with these ancient people, it appeared as though once you said something, you didn't get to take it back. You couldn't say, well, look, you deceived me, so it doesn't count. It was like, they weren't maybe as well, weak might be one way of thinking about it, but another way is they weren't quite as attentive to context, because if I make you a deal and then it turns out that you've betrayed me, I may feel that the deal is no longer valid because the assumption was you were being honest to begin with, and that, violates the whole spirit. But that isn't how these people thought. They said, once you promised, man, you promised, and that was that. So Isaac blesses Jacob. He says, let God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of corn and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over thy brethren. That's going to be rough on Esau. Let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be everyone that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee. And so there's quite a remarkable painting of that. So there's Rebecca. She's looking pretty old, and Isaac's looking pretty blind, and Jacob's taking directions from his mother, and we might say he's perhaps a little old to be taking moral lessons from his mother, especially given how she's acting. And so it's a pretty ugly scene altogether, especially that we also know that Jacob already tricked Esau out of his birthright. And so now he's like taken the birthright and he's taken the blessing. And so, as I said, that Jacob, he turns out to be the father of Israel. It's like, he's a reprehensible character. These are major league betrayals that he's engaging in. It's not trivial. He really, really pulls the rug out from under his brother. And you could say, well, Esau is not as awake as he might be. He's kind of a wild man, and fair enough. But it certainly seems to me that the predominant moral error falls on Jacob's shoulders. It's very treacherous behavior, what he's doing. So then Esau shows up, and he's got a nice stag for his dad, and it's like a little late for that. And he states that his brother was rightly named Jacob, which means supplanter, because he's been deceived twice. And Isaac answered, he's asking, Esau is asking fundamentally if there's anything at all left over for him. And Isaac can't give him the same blessing because that's already been given, so he has to think of something else. And Isaac says, behold, I've made him thy Lord, and all his brothers I've given to him for servants, which includes you. And with corn and wine have I sustained him. And what shall I now do unto thee, my son? And Esau said unto his father, have you even one blessing for me, my father? And bless me also. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And, we already know that Esau is a pretty tough guy, by all appearances. And, he's out there hunting on his own and camping, and it's like he's no pushover. And the fact that this reduces him to tears is an indication of the magnitude of the betrayal. And Isaac says, behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above. And by thy sword thou shalt live, and thou shalt serve your brother. And it shall come to pass when you will have the dominion, and you'll break his yoke off from thy neck. And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will slay my brother Jacob. So fundamentally, if Isaac dies, or when he dies, then we'll mourn for him, and then Jacob better look the hell out, because it's like it's serious death coming his way. And he's got a point. He's in Dante's Inferno. I think I mentioned this at one point. So Dante's Inferno, it's a very interesting story. It's a descent into hell, and it's actually one of the places that we sort of derive the popular conception of hell was partly based on Dante's imagination, on his work. And what Dante was trying to do was to discover the hierarchical structure of evil. And you might think there's a hierarchical structure of good. Some things are better than other things, but there's also a hierarchical structure of evil. Some evils are greater than other evils. And he put betrayal in the lowest part of hell. Right? So if you were betraying people, you were right beside Satan himself. And I think that's good. That's very smart. Well, Dante was a genius after all. And I think the reason for that is that, you see, if someone trusts you, they're laying their vulnerability open to you. Now, they might just be naive, let's say, and we won't think about that, because you're just a child if you're naive. You can still be betrayed. But if you're an adult and you trust, it's often because if you're an actual adult, it's you willingly open yourself up, knowing that you could be hurt, right? Because you're not naive anymore. So you decide to trust, and you say, I'll open myself up, and I know that I'm laying myself open to you if you choose to use that power. And then that's a good thing to know. If you've been hurt as a child or hurt as a naive person, you might say, well, why should I ever trust again? Which is a really good question. And the answer is, the reason you trust again once you're an adult is because you're courageous. You're courageous. It's an act of courage to trust. And the reason it's useful is because if you trust someone, you open the door to reciprocity and negotiation and cooperation, and you entice the best part of the person forward. And so it's a courageous act. But then if you betray someone, then what you've done is you've taken the best part of them, which is the part that will courageously trust, with open eyes, right? And you've stuck a dagger in that. And so you've purposefully damaged the best part of them. And so that's why it's such a egregious fault. And it's often people don't recover from that sort of thing. If you betray someone badly enough, you can damage them. Like, you can give them post-traumatic stress disorder if you really put your mind to it. That's not just a psychological disorder. If you have post-traumatic stress disorder, it produces permanent neurological alterations that make you more neurotic, more sensitive to negative emotion, really for the rest of your life. Like, you can recover from it to some degree, but stress will tend to re-instantiate the PTSD. So you hurt someone, and it's not merely not that psychological is merely, but it's not merely psychological, right? It's fundamental physiological damage. So, anyways, Jacob's smart enough to get out of there, and which is also not really a testament to his integrity, right? I mean, he's done these terrible things at the behest of his mother because he wants power, and he wants to get it without deserving it, and then he finally goes too far and he hightails it out of there to another family member, to his mother's brother. And so it's not exactly the world's most heroic story, that's for sure. And so now there's an interlude here, and this is a really interesting interlude. It's the story of Jacob's ladder. So he's off to visit Laban, who's his mother's brother. And on the way, he has a sleep. And he lighted upon a certain place and tarried there all night, because the sun was set, and he took of the stones of that place and put them for his pillows, which seems to indicate very bad planning on his part, and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and beheld a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and beheld the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it, and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed. And so this story of Jacob's ladder has really possessed the imagination of the West. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's an archetypal story, because the idea of a ladder that reaches to heaven is one of the oldest ideas of mankind. Mm-hmm. So you find it widely distributed among the shamanic cultures, for example. And it's a hallmark of psychedelic experience. That's another way of thinking about it, which is a very peculiar thing. So there's one representation of the ladder. You see God up at the top there, peeking out from the clouds. Now, that's sort of where we get the idea that God is in heaven, and then heaven's up in the sky, and that's an easy story to make fun of, because we've gone up to the moon and there's no God there, but this is not a reasonable way of
See, when you say shit like that, when he says stuff like that, that bothers me a lot. How could he be so intelligent but yet still believe that the moon is what we were told it was? I mean, the evidence is too great. You have to be such a dumbed down zombie fucking slave, in other words, a genius, to believe that people went to the moon. The moon's not what we were told it was. I'll probably get a good start on the moon on this series, but it does a lot of that. You do a lot of that. This is the start of the Jordan Peterson series, and I'm just running through some videos that I've been making that I'm going to apply to his channel, to his series. But it just bothers me, and I gotta sit here and listen to shit like this while I'm doing these series, but give me something to complain about, I guess.
Experience is very difficult to tell, because we don't know what these old people were up to, right? And we don't know how much of the archaic religious tradition was still extant at that point in time. But we certainly do know that our ancient forebears were using psychedelic substances constantly, like Amanita muscaria mushrooms, for example, which were widely used in India before they became extinct. That's the theory, anyways. That seemed to be the basis of the chemical soma, which much has been written about. And so we hear of this as a dream or as a vision, and perhaps that's what it was, but perhaps that wasn't what it was either, and perhaps it was an experience that was induced by the same processes that shamanic people have always induced these experiences. And so we're going to go through this a little bit. So anyways, there's a connection between heaven and earth that opens up. That's the vision. And there's messengers moving up and down. Now, one way you can conceptualize that is psychologically, as we already discussed, that there are forces within you that are active and alive, and you can think of them in some sense as messengers of the higher self, and so you could think about this as an image of a psychological reality. And so we can stick with that, but here's some of the representations that have been made. I really like the one on the right. That's William Blake. I like the helix idea, and I don't think that that's fluke. There are helixes and double helixes and all sorts of imagery, very ancient and very modern, that are associated with both healing and with this kind of vision. So, and you see in the Blake representation, God is associated with, well, really with the sun and with light. And you see that on the left as well, that wherever God is where light is. And so that's a very interesting idea as far as I'm concerned as well. There's some other representations. One by Chagall. So now there's this idea that there's the possibility of opening up a line of communication between the human psyche and the transcendent divine. And there's a great image of Christ as Pantocrator, so creator of the world. It is one of the first mosaics, if I remember correctly, and I wish I remembered where it was, but I don't. But it's a very interesting image. I'm having a carving of it made at the moment by a friend of mine, but you see Christ's face portrayed in a medieval manner, and he's holding a book. So it symbolizes the importance of the book, as a means of transmitting wisdom. And his face is very asymmetrical, and the eyes are different, one side and the other, and one half of the face represents the human part, and the other side of the face represents the divine part. And I also think about that psychologically, because I do think that that's the right way to conceptualize human beings, is that there's an aspect of us that's mortal and human and limited, but there's an aspect of us that's transcendent and divine as well. And it's latent in some sense, but there are times when it manifests itself. And this is not speculation, right? This is like the oldest experience of human beings. Now, it's not necessarily an easy experience to have, but it's reported everywhere, and it can be reliably induced, as we've discussed before, by chemical means, and I don't know what that means exactly. We've talked a little bit about psilocybin mushrooms, for example, and you could say that the mystical experiences that have been invoked in the newest experiments down at Johns Hopkins are derangements or forms of psychosis, because they have some similarity to psychotic experiences, although psychotic people were given LSD in the 60s, and they always said that that was something different than what they were having. And if you give psychotic people amphetamines, you can make them worse. So they're biochemically separate, and we know that. But also the thing that's so interesting about the psilocybin experiences is that they reliably produce mystical experiences that the people rate as among the most important experiences of their life. And among those who have the psychedelic experience, positive things happen to them. And so that kind of messes with the whole psychosis theory, right? Because what are you going to do? You're going to claim that you give someone a pill and they have a psychotic break and then they're healthier. It's like, no, that isn't how psychotic breaks work. You're not healthier after having one. You're a broken egg, and it's not easy to put you back together. So, and we know that people all over the world have discovered every manner of psychedelic substance that you could possibly. Well, you imagine there's lots of hungry people wandering the earth for a long time, and they ate every damn thing they could get their hands on, and now and then something very peculiar happened as a consequence. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the shamanic tradition because it's associated with Jacob's ladder. So, according to Mircea Eliade, he was a great historian of religion, a compatriot of Jung's, and they influenced each other quite substantially. Eliade believed that shamanism that used psychedelics was a degeneration from the original, more pure shamanism. But I think later scholarship has demonstrated that that's incorrect, that the shamanic ritual per se was a direct consequence of the discovery of, and ritualistic use of psychedelic substances. But anyways, Eliade identified 3 pathways to shamanism. And the shaman in a tribe was more educated than the typical person, with a larger vocabulary, and was the repository of the oral tradition. And so learned all the stories that had been passed down word to mouth. And people, by the way, are can very accurately tell the same story across generations. That's been quite well documented. So, and people who can't read really can remember, because what else are they going to do? Their memories are far greater than modern people's memories, because we can forget everything because we can just look it up. But they remembered things because they had no choice. My father knew someone who was illiterate and couldn't use numbers either when he grew up in Saskatchewan, 60 years ago. And he had sheep, if I remember correctly. And although he couldn't count, he knew if one of his sheep was missing, because he knew all the sheep. And so he could tell just by looking if one of the sheep was missing, but he couldn't count. And so people who don't have our particular set of skills, first of all, they're not stupid, and second, they have other skills that we don't understand to fill in the gaps. So Eliade identified spontaneous vocation. So you had the spirit of a shaman, let's say, so you're probably extremely high in openness, let's say, from a modern perspective. Hereditary transmission, so your father was a shaman and your grandfather was a shaman and so forth, and you got initiated into that process, or a personal quest. In Siberia, this is from Eliade, in Siberia, the youth who is called to be a shaman attracts attention by his strange behavior. For example, he seeks solitude, becomes absent-minded, loves to roam in the woods or unfrequented places, has visions and sings in his sleep. If you put someone in a place that's deprived, where you're deprived from a sensory perspective, normal people will hallucinate quite quickly. So it seems what happens is that if you dampen down the sensory input, then you start to become aware of the background processes of your mind. It's something like that. It's like the signal to noise ratio. I got to get this right. As the noise decreases, some of the noise becomes signal, the background noise becomes signal, and you start to become aware of your own internal psychological processes. It's something like that. He has visions and sings in his sleep. In some instances, this period of incubation is marked by quite serious symptoms. Among the Yakut, the young man sometimes has fits of fury and easily loses consciousness, hides in the forest, feeds on the bark of trees, throws himself into water and fire, and cuts himself with knives. We went to a potlatch on northern Vancouver Island about a year ago, and they had this one dance. It was the Kwakwaka'wakw natives, and they had this interesting dance that was the dance of the wild man. And so the person who invited us was the wild man, and he was dressed up in tree branches and so forth. And so he was the person who'd been in the bush too long, and he came in as a cannibal. And there was genuine cannibalistic rites among these people not so long ago. He came in as a cannibal, and everybody had to wear this like cedar headdress, because if you had a cedar headdress on, then the cannibal wouldn't take a bite out of you. And they actually took this rather seriously, so you should have your cedar headdress on. And so he's looking around the crowd, and there's like 400 people in this place, and he could really act too. So he's doing this wild man dance, and then all the women stood up and started to kind of dance in place and sing, and they were taming him. So that was really cool. It was really interesting to see that, because those people they've had an unbroken culture for about 13,000 years, eh? That's how long they've been out on the island there. And it was very interesting to see that dramatization of the domestication of man by women laid out in that dance in that way. But it was also interesting in relationship to the shamanic tradition, because he came in as a wild man, right? And he had to be civilized in some sense and brought
These two
back down to
pupils,
earth.
look at them, they're directional.
So,
they're both looking up.
but by whatever
that way.
method he may have been designated, a shaman is
There's
recognized
face
as
right here
such
that I'm gonna
only
crop for
after
you.
having received 2 methods of
Got a
instruction.
mustache.
The first is ecstatic, dreams, trances, visions. The other thing that this guy told me, and and I have no reason to doubt him. He's also not a literate person, and so has a great memory. He does carving, traditional carving, and he's very good at it. He carved a 53-foot totem pole that's now in front of the Museum of Art in downtown Montreal. So if you ever go there, you can go see it. It won't be there forever, but it's there right now. And he was taught to carve by his grandparents, and he said that he dreamed in, you know what the Haida images look like. So the Kwakwaka'waks are kind of like the Haida, same sort of imagery. He told me that he dreamed in those images. So when he dreams, that's the form that the things he dreams about takes. And he also said that he would talk to his grandparents in his dreams. So if he was working on a piece of wood and trying to figure out how to carve it, and he ran into a particularly difficult problem, he'd dream and he'd have a conversation with his grandparents, and they'd help him figure out how to solve the problem, and then he'd wake up and he could go carve the. And the thing is, he told me these things sort of matter-of-factly, right? Like, you know what I mean? It wasn't like he was telling me these weird things that happened to him, although he was doing that to some degree. I asked him a lot of questions about what he carved and what it all meant, and that was just part of his explanation of how he did it. And he carved me a couple of doors that I have in my house, and one of them is quite interesting. Well, the two make a panel, and they're an underwater scene, and under the water there's a bunch of mythical monsters. Some of them are killer whales, and I think there's an octopus down there, and carved in this particular style. And he said that the other thing that happens to him when he dreams is he goes down to the bottom of the water where these mythical creatures are, and he gets inspiration from them. And so I thought that was extremely interesting too. We don't know what a mind that isn't hyper civilized, let's say, hyper literate like our minds are, because we're so bombarded by external stimuli. We have no idea what the natural mind is like, really. And so it was quite interesting to listen to that, and also to see the consequences, because he's quite a great carver. So the first is ecstatic, dreams, trances, visions. The second is traditional, shamanic techniques, names and functions of the spirits, mythology and genealogy of the clan, the secret language. This twofold teaching imparted by the spirits and the old master shamans constitutes initiation. Well, so, modern people have a problem with that because we don't really get initiated, but I would say that, let's say that we're each on a quest of some sort. You wouldn't be here, I don't think, if you weren't, because why else would you be here? And so you're on a quest of some sort to figure out, to struggle with the meaning of life, let's say. And you don't want to do that alone, because you only last like 70 years, and good luck figuring it out on your own. It's just not going to happen. It's too complicated, and you'll be too isolated, right? If it's just you, that's insanity. No one can stand that. And so you hope that other people have things to tell you, and that your culture has something to tell you, so you're on a quest, maybe not with the same intensity as a shamanic initiate, but, let's give you some credit. And then you're also trying to understand the wisdom of the past. And that's the second part of this. It's like, okay, well, you're a human being, and human beings have been telling stories for a long period of time, trying to figure out what's going on, trying to figure out how to orient themselves in the world. And so, partly what you're doing here is exactly what the shamanic initiate does in the second part of the process, which is to expose yourself to the degree that you can to names and functions of the spirits, mythology and genealogy of the clan, and the secret language. This twofold teaching, imparted by the spirits and the old master shamans, constitutes initiation. So that's a rebirth, right? That's what initiation is. It's being born again. And that's a birth of the spirit rather than of the body. It's something like that. And so it's the rebirth of an integrated psyche. That's one way of thinking about it. And a psyche that's individual, but also grounded in common humanity, in the wisdom of common humanity. And that makes you strong, or at least it makes you stronger. Because there's a limit to your strength, but God only knows to some degree what that limit is. People can be unbelievably tough. And I think it's even the more admirable for human beings to be tough, because we're so conscious of how we can be hurt. And we're so conscious of what that hurt can lead to. You can have your family taken away from you, and you can be destroyed. And the fact that you can be courageous in the face of that at all is something that is absolutely unbelievable, right? And people deserve a lot more credit, I think, than people give themselves, because the fact that we can be honorable under conditions of life and death, right, of suffering, that's a testament to the human spirit. And there's a profound anti-human ethos, I think, that pervades our culture, that considers human beings cancers on the planet, something like that, and that there should be less of us. It's the same spirit that motivated the guy who wrote the book about it better to have never been. And it's like, I don't see it that way, I mean, I think people do pretty well for having their leg caught in a bear trap and their head caught in a vice. They're actually doing pretty well, because life is really hard, and the fact that we're not absolutely brutal and murderous all the time is really something remarkable, given what we actually have to contend with, that we can go out of our way to be honest and generous and altruistic and to care for each other under unbelievably dire circumstances, and to act nobly sometimes under the most trying conditions. In Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, he tells story after story of people who acted abysmally, but also people who, under the worst threats imaginable, never sacrificed their character. And reading about that is really, well, it really makes you wonder. That's what it does. The future shamans among the Tungus, as they approach maturity, go through a hysterical or a hysteroid crisis, but sometimes their vocation manifests itself at an earlier age. The boy runs away into the mountains and remains there for a week or more, feeding on animals which he tears to pieces. And it is not true that shamans always are or always have to be neuropathic, mentally deranged. On the other hand, and this is the critical issue, those among them who had been ill become shamans precisely because they had succeeded in becoming cured. So it's not the descent into this strange subterranean psychological state that constitutes the transformation that makes the shaman, but it's the emergence back out of that, and that's a journey to the light, and so.
Okay, so I'll just mention it. I don't know what's so special about this video, but it started twirling on me, right? And then I was watching it from the other side of the room. So I'm going in, and it bumped me onto airplane mode, and then it bumped me off of Wi-Fi. So I put those back on. I'm still getting the circle. And I don't get it from over here, but as soon as it runs into over here, and now I've got Wi-Fi and everything. So there's something from here to here that they're not going to allow me to play. I think that's just weird. Let me see.